Hey guys, tonight we begin not with warriors or kings, but with ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances where survival itself became an act of defiance against fate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1914, and Ernest Shackleton stands on the deck of the Endurance, watching the ice close in like the jaws of some ancient beast. He's not worried yet. Not really. He's been to Antarctica before, knows its moods, its tricks. But this ice is different. It doesn't just surround the ship. It swallows it. Within weeks, the Endurance is trapped, frozen solid in the Weddell Sea, miles from any coastline, months from any rescue. The expedition to cross Antarctica on foot hasn't even begun, and already it's over. What follows isn't an adventure. It's a masterclass in refusing to die. Shackleton had recruited his crew with an advertisement that was brutally honest. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness. Safe return doubtful. Hundreds applied, because in 1914, there were still men who believed that glory mattered more than comfort, that legacy was worth frostbite. 27 souls answered that call, and for the next 2 years, Shackleton would keep every single one of them alive through sheer willpower and an almost supernatural ability to inspire hope when hope had no business existing. The ice didn't crush the Endurance quickly. It tortured it. For months, the ship groaned and buckled as pressure built. The men could hear it at night, the sound of timber screaming, the hull splintering like bones. They tried to free the ship, hacking at ice with picks, ramming it with the bow. Nothing worked. The Antarctic had decided to keep them, and the Antarctic always got what it wanted. Finally, in October 1915, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. They watched as the Endurance, their home, their only connection to civilization, was swallowed by the ice and dragged beneath the frozen sea. Now they had nothing. 3 lifeboats, some supplies, and 1,000 miles of ice between them and salvation. They set up camp on an ice floe, a floating island of frozen water that drifted north at the mercy of currents they couldn't control. 4 months, they lived on this moving prison, hunting seals, rationing food, waiting for the ice to break up enough that they could launch the boats. Shackleton rotated duties to keep morale high, told jokes when the men looked too long at the horizon, and never, not once, let them see his fear. He knew that if he broke, they all broke. So he didn't break. Not when the ice cracked beneath their tents. Not when their floe split in 2 during the night. Not when they ran out of tobacco and the men, hardened sailors and scientists alike, wept like children. Finally, in April 1916, the ice released them. They launched the lifeboats into the most hostile waters on Earth, the Drake Passage, where waves the size of buildings rolled endlessly and the temperature could kill an exposed man in minutes. For 7 days, they rowed and bailed water, their hands frozen to the oars, their clothes stiff with ice. Shackleton navigated by dead reckoning and sheer instinct, aiming for a speck of rock called Elephant Island. It was uninhabited, barren, and utterly worthless. But it was land. Solid ground. The first they'd felt in over a year. When they dragged the boats ashore, grown men collapsed and kissed the stones. But Elephant Island wasn't salvation. It was a waiting room for death. No ships passed this way. No rescue would come. If they stayed, they'd starve or freeze before winter ended. So Shackleton made a decision that defied sanity. He would take 5 men and sail one of the lifeboats 800 miles across the Southern Ocean to South Georgia Island, where there was a whaling station. 800 miles. In a 22-foot boat. Through seas that had destroyed ships 10 times its size. His crew thought he was mad. He probably was. But madness, in that moment, was the only rational choice. They reinforced the lifeboat, the James Caird, with wood and canvas, loaded it with provisions for a month, and said goodbye to the men left behind. 22 souls watching 6 disappear into the gray, praying they'd see them again. The voyage of the James Caird is considered one of the greatest feats of navigation in history. For 16 days, they sailed through storms that turned the sky black, waves that flipped the boat nearly vertical, and cold so brutal that ice formed on their clothing mid-movement, turning them into statues that had to be chipped free. Shackleton steered by sextant when the clouds broke, by intuition when they didn't. One mistake, 1 degree off course, and they'd miss South Georgia entirely, sail into empty ocean until the food ran out and the sea claimed them. On the 15th day, they saw land. Mountains rising from the mist like a hymn. South Georgia. They'd made it, except they'd landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station was on the other coast, across a mountain range that had never been crossed. No maps, no equipment, no time. Shackleton, along with 2 others, left the remaining men on the beach and began to climb. For 36 hours, they ascended glaciers, crossed crevasses, descended cliffs by sliding down on their backs with rope tied around their waists. They didn't sleep. They couldn't afford to. Every hour wasted was another hour closer to the men on Elephant Island running out of hope. When they finally stumbled into the whaling station, the manager didn't recognize them. 3 men, bearded, filthy, their clothes in tatters, appeared out of the mountains like ghosts. Shackleton had to tell him twice who he was. The whalers couldn't believe it. The Endurance expedition was presumed dead. The world had already mourned them. But here was Shackleton, half dead himself, asking not for rest but for a ship. He needed to go back. His men were still waiting. It took 4 attempts to reach Elephant Island. Ice blocked the first 3 rescue missions. On the 4th, in August 1916, nearly 2 years after the Endurance had first become trapped, Shackleton finally broke through. The men on the island had given up hope weeks ago. They were starving, sick, ready to die. Then someone saw a ship on the horizon. Shackleton was standing on the bow, scanning the shore, counting. 22 men, all alive. Not one lost. When he stepped ashore, the men didn't cheer. They wept. Because they'd survived the impossible, and the man who'd promised to bring them home had kept his word. The Endurance expedition failed in every measurable way. They never crossed Antarctica. They lost their ship, their supplies, their timeline. But Shackleton brought every man back alive, and in doing so, became a legend. His survival wasn't about physical strength or superior technology. It was about refusing to let despair win. About leading with humor when hope was thin, with decisiveness when others froze, and with compassion when the world offered none. The Antarctic tried to kill them for 2 years. It failed. Because some men, when cornered by fate, simply refused to die quietly. Now we turn to the Pacific, 1942, where survival became a solitary endurance test for one man drifting alone on a raft in the vastness of the ocean. Poon Lim was a Chinese sailor, a second steward aboard a British merchant ship, the SS Ben Lomond. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for combat. He was just trying to survive a war that had turned every ocean into a battlefield. In November 1942, the Ben Lomond was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Brazil. The ship sank in minutes. Of the 55 crew members, Poon Lim was one of the few who made it to a lifeboat. Then he watched that lifeboat drift away in the chaos, leaving him alone in the water with nothing but a life jacket and rapidly fading hope. He swam for 2 hours before finding a wooden raft, 8 feet by 8 feet, equipped with basic survival supplies. A few tins of biscuits, a water jug, some flares, and a flashlight. Enough, the designers thought, to last a few days until rescue. Poon Lim would be on that raft for 133 days. 4.5 months. Alone. Drifting across the Atlantic with no land in sight, no ships passing, and no guarantee that anyone even knew he was alive. Most men would have lost their minds in the first week. Poon Lim rationed his supplies like an accountant and refused to waste energy on despair. The biscuits ran out after a week. The water, despite careful rationing, was gone in too. After that, survival became a daily negotiation with the sea. He caught rainwater in a canvas tarp, sometimes going days without a drop, his lips cracking, his tongue swelling. When fish swam near the raft, he fashioned a hook from a nail and wire, using biscuit crumbs as bait. It took him days to catch the first one. A small mackerel, raw and salty. He ate it in tiny bites, savoring each piece like a feast. Over time, he became skilled. He caught fish regularly, even managed to spear a small shark with a makeshift weapon he'd fashioned from a piece of wood and a knife. He ate its flesh, drank its blood for moisture, and used its liver oil to protect his skin from the sun. The sun was relentless. It turned his skin dark and leathery, blistered his face, made every day a furnace. At night, the cold came, and with it, the loneliness. The ocean is vast, but it's also loud. Waves crashing, wind howling, creatures moving beneath the surface. Poon Lim heard it all and learned to find comfort in the noise. He exercised every day, doing push-ups and squats on the tiny raft to keep his muscles from wasting. He read the sky, tracked the stars, and slowly drifted west, carried by currents he couldn't control toward a destination he couldn't predict. Ships passed twice in those 133 days. The first didn't see him. He waved, shouted, fired a flare. Nothing. The ship disappeared over the horizon, and Poon Lim watched it go, feeling hope die a little. The second ship did see him, but it didn't stop. It was a German vessel, and in the chaos of war, a lone Chinese sailor on a raft wasn't worth the risk. So they left him. Again alone. Most men would have given up, would have let the sea take them. Poon Lim kept fishing, kept rationing, kept moving, because giving up required a decision, and he simply chose not to make it. On April 5, 1943, Brazilian fishermen spotted the raft off the coast near Belém. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A man, alive, tanned dark as leather, thin but coherent, waving calmly as if he'd been expecting them. When they pulled him aboard, Poon Lim could barely walk. His legs had forgotten how to support weight. But he was alive. 133 days. The longest anyone has ever survived alone at sea on a raft. A record that still stands today. The British Navy interviewed him extensively, trying to understand how he'd done it. His techniques were added to survival manuals. King George VI awarded him the British Empire Medal. But Poon Lim didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a man who didn't quit. After the war, he tried to immigrate to the United States, but was denied under the Chinese Exclusion Act. It took an act of Congress and personal intervention from Senator Warren Magnuson to overturn the decision. The man who'd survived the impossible was nearly defeated by paperwork. He eventually settled in Brooklyn, worked as a carpenter, lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about the raft. When asked how he survived, he'd shrug and say he was lucky. But luck doesn't catch fish with a nail. Luck doesn't ration water for 4 months. Luck doesn't wake up every morning on an endless ocean and choose to keep trying. That's not luck. That's will. From the sea, we moved to the mountains, where in 1972, survival required not just endurance but impossible choices. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was carrying a rugby team, their families, and friends from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile. 45 people, most of them young, excited, ready for a weekend of sport and celebration. The flight path took them over the Andes, one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges on Earth. The pilots, experienced but overconfident, misjudged their position in bad weather. When they began their descent, thinking they'd cleared the peaks, they were still deep in the mountains. The plane clipped a ridge, lost both wings, and tumbled down a glacier before finally stopping in a remote valley at 12,000 feet. 12 people died in the crash. 33 survived. But survival in that frozen hell would require them to become something they'd never imagined. The fuselage became their shelter, a metal tube half buried in snow, freezing at night, barely warmer during the day. They had no winter clothing, no real food, and no way to signal for help. The radio was dead. The emergency supplies consisted of a few bottles of wine, some chocolate, and snacks meant for a short flight. That food was gone in 2 days. Search planes flew overhead for a week, but the white plane against white snow was invisible. The survivors waved frantically, screamed until their voices broke. The planes never saw them. Then, on the 8th day, they heard on a small transistor radio that the search had been called off. They were presumed dead. No one was coming. They were alone. Stranded. surrounded by peaks so high and snow so deep that escape seemed impossible. 4 days, they survived on melted snow and hope. But hope doesn't fill an empty stomach. People began to weaken. Several more died from injuries and the cold. The survivors, mostly young men in their teens and 20s, faced a truth so awful it paralyzed them. They were going to starve to death. Unless the bodies of the dead were preserved in the snow, frozen solid, like a macabre pantry they couldn't bear to acknowledge. For days, no one spoke the thought aloud. Then one of them, Nando Paradu, broke the silence. He said what everyone was thinking. If we want to live, we have to eat. Not plants, not animals, each other. The room, that freezing metal tomb, went silent. Some wept. Others turned away. But slowly, reluctantly, they agreed. They were Catholics, most of them, raised to believe in the sanctity of the body, the soul, the resurrection. But they were also dying, and the dead, they reasoned, would want them to live. They began with small pieces, cut from the frozen bodies of those who had already passed. They prayed before eating, asked for forgiveness, and made a pact. If any of them died, the others had permission to do the same. It wasn't murder. It wasn't desecration. It was survival in its rawest, most unforgiving form. And it kept them alive. For 72 days, they endured. Avalanches buried the fuselage, killing more. The cold gnawed at their bodies. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. But the food, however unthinkable, gave them strength. Enough strength for 2 of them, Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa, to attempt the impossible. They would climb out of the valley, cross the Andes on foot, and find help. It was suicide. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. They had no gear, no map, no training. But staying meant dying slowly. So they chose to die trying. For 10 days they climbed. Up glaciers, across ridges, through snowstorms that should have killed them. They walked until their legs gave out, then rested and walked again. On the 9th day, Paradu reached the top of a peak, expecting to see Chile, civilization, rescue. Instead, he saw more mountains. Endless white peaks stretching to the horizon. He fell to his knees and wept. Canessa thought they were finished. But Paradu stood up, pointed to a valley far below where he'd seen something green. A river maybe. They descended. For another day, they stumbled down the mountain, delirious, starving, held together by nothing but momentum. Then they saw it. A man on horseback. A Chilean farmer, tending cattle in a remote valley. He saw 2 skeletal figures, bearded, filthy, waving desperately from across the river. He threw them bread tied to a stone. The next day he returned with help. On December 22, 1972, helicopters landed in the valley where the fuselage lay. 16 survivors emerged, blinking in the sunlight, barely able to stand. They'd been given up for dead 2 months earlier. The world celebrated their rescue, called it a miracle. Then the truth came out. What they'd done to survive. The media exploded. Some called them savages. Others heroes. Religious leaders debated the morality. But the survivors didn't need the world's permission. They'd already made peace with their choice. They'd done what they had to do, and they'd come home. Now we turn to the Arctic, where in 1881, survival meant not adventure, but bureaucratic incompetence turned deadly. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition, led by Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, was sent by the U.S. Army to establish a scientific station in the far north of Canada, closer to the North Pole than any American had been before. 25 men, supplies for 3 years, and a clear resupply plan. Ships would bring fresh provisions every summer. Simple. Except the ships never came. The first summer, ice blocked the route. The second, the supply ship sank. The third, bureaucracy and miscommunication meant no attempt was even made. Greely and his men, camped at Fort Conger on Ellesmere Island, had no idea they'd been abandoned. By the summer of 1883, with food running out, Greely gave the order to retreat south to Cape Sabine, where emergency caches were supposed to be waiting. They loaded 3 small boats and sailed down the coast, racing the onset of winter. When they reached Cape Sabine, they found the caches. Or what was left of them. A few 100 pounds of food meant to last weeks. They'd need it to last a year. The men built a crude shelter from stones and an overturned lifeboat, a structure so flimsy that wind blew through the walls. They rationed the food to starvation levels. 4 ounces per man per day. A mouthful of meat, a spoonful of bread. Enough to keep them technically alive, but not enough to stop the slow death that followed. Winter in the Arctic is not cold. It's an assault. Temperatures dropped to -50. Darkness lasted months. The men huddled together for warmth, their bodies wasting, their minds fraying. They ate lichens scraped from rocks. Boiled sealskin boots for the gelatin. Caught and devoured a few tiny shrimp in the shallows. One man shot a fox. They fought over the scraps. As the months crawled by, men began to die. Not quickly, but slowly, their bodies shutting down organ by organ. Greeley, disciplined to the end, kept order as long as he could. He read from scientific journals, held classes, maintained logs. Anything to keep the men from descending into madness. But madness came anyway. One man was caught stealing food from the dwindling supplies. Greeley, after a tribunal, ordered him executed. The man was shot and buried in the ice. It's unclear whether Greeley had legal authority for the execution, but in that frozen wasteland, authority was whatever kept the group from tearing itself apart. Another man simply walked out into the snow one night and didn't come back. His body was found months later, frozen in a sitting position, his face turned toward the south, as if still hoping to see a ship. By the time a rescue expedition finally arrived in June 1884, only 7 men were alive. Barely. Greeley weighed 120 pounds, down from 180. He could no longer stand. The others were skeletal, delirious, hovering at the edge of death. The rescuers wept at what they found. 18 men had died. When the survivors returned to the United States, there was no parade. The press focused on the cannibalism rumors, unproven but persistent. Greeley's execution of Private Henry became a scandal. The expedition was called a disaster, a failure, a national embarrassment. Greeley defended his actions for the rest of his life. He'd kept 7 men alive when all 25 should have died. He'd maintained discipline when chaos would have killed them faster. He'd survived. But survival, in the public eye, wasn't enough. They wanted heroes. What they got were starving men who'd done unthinkable things to stay alive. From the poles, we moved to the jungles, where survival meant not just outlasting nature, but escaping other humans. Julianne Coep was 17 years old on Christmas Eve, 1971, when she boarded Lanza Flight 508 in Lima, Peru, with her mother. They were flying home to Pucallpa after Julianne's high school graduation. The flight was routine. Until it wasn't. The plane flew into a thunderstorm, a wall of black clouds that the pilots thought they could navigate through. They were wrong. Lightning struck the right wing. The fuel tank exploded. The plane disintegrated in midair, 2 miles above the Amazon rainforest. 93 people fell from the sky. Julianne, still strapped to her seat, was one of them. She fell 10,000 feet. Somehow, impossibly, the thick jungle canopy and the seat acting as a crude parachute slowed her descent enough that she survived. She woke up the next morning on the forest floor, alone, injured, and surrounded by wreckage. Her collarbone was broken. She had a concussion, a gash on her leg, and one eye swollen shut. But she was alive. She called for her mother, searched the debris, found bodies, found luggage, found nothing useful. No food, no water, no people. Just the jungle, infinite and indifferent. Julianne's father was a biologist who taught her jungle survival. Follow water downstream. Rivers lead to civilization. She found a creek and began to walk. For 10 days, she stumbled through the rainforest, wading through streams, sleeping in the mud, eating nothing. Her wounds festered. Maggots burrowed into her arm. She could feel them moving under her skin. She picked them out with a stick, one by one, trying not to scream. The jungle tried to kill her in 1,000 small ways. Insects bit her constantly. Leeches clung to her legs. She heard jaguars at night, their growls echoing through the trees. Piranhas swam in the rivers she waded through. But she kept moving. Downstream. Always downstream. On the 10th day, She found a boat moored at a riverbank, and nearby, a small shelter used by loggers. She collapsed inside and waited. The next day, 3 men returned from their work and found a teenage girl, half dead, covered in mud and blood, speaking German and Spanish in a delirium. They gave her food, cleaned her wounds, and took her downriver to the nearest village. From there, she was flown to a hospital. She was the sole survivor of Flight 508. 92 people died in that crash. Julianne Coep walked out of the Amazon rainforest. Now we travel to the Sahara, where survival meant navigating an ocean of sand with no water and no map. Mauro Prosperi was an Italian police officer and a pentathlete, an experienced endurance athlete who decided in 1994 to compete in the Marathon des Sables, a 6-day ultramarathon across the Moroccan Sahara. It's called the toughest foot race on Earth. 250 kilometers through sand dunes, with competitors carrying their own food and gear. Prosperi had trained for months. He was ready. On the 4th day, a sandstorm hit. Visibility dropped to 0. Winds howled. Runners huddled together, waiting for it to pass. When the storm cleared, Prosperi found himself alone. Disoriented. He tried to retrace his steps. But in the desert, footprints disappear in minutes. He walked for hours, then days, searching for the course markers, for other runners, for anything familiar. Nothing. He was alone in the Sahara with a few energy bars, a knife, and a rapidly emptying water bottle. By the 3rd day, he'd drunk his own urine. By the 5th, he was eating bats he caught in an abandoned shrine, raw, drinking their blood for moisture. He tried to kill himself. Slit his wrists with his knife. But he was so dehydrated that his blood clotted almost immediately. He couldn't even die properly. So he kept walking. For 9 days, Prosperi wandered the desert, crossing from Morocco into Algeria without realizing it. He walked over 180 miles in the wrong direction, deeper into the Sahara. He should have died a dozen times over. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, starvation, exposure. But his body, trained for endurance, refused to quit. On the 9th day, a nomadic tribe found him. He was skeletal, sunburned, barely conscious. They gave him water, goat's milk, shelter. He'd lost 35 pounds. His liver was failing, but he was alive. When he finally returned to Italy, the press called it a miracle. Prosperi called it stubbornness. He went back to the Marathon des Sables 4 years later and finished it. Let's shift now to the mountains of the Himalayas, where in 1985, 2 climbers faced a choice that still haunts mountaineering ethics. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates were climbing Silla Grande in the Peruvian Andes, a 21,000-foot peak that had never been summited via the west face. They made it to the top. The descent should have been routine. It wasn't. On the way down, Simpson slipped and shattered his leg, the bone breaking through the skin. At 20,000 feet, with a storm moving in and no rescue possible, a broken leg is a death sentence. Yates knew it. Simpson knew it. But Yates tried anyway. He began lowering Simpson down the mountain using ropes, 150 feet at a time, in the dark, in a blizzard. For hours, they descended this way. Then Simpson went over an ice cliff and dangled in midair, unable to touch the ground, unable to climb back up. Yates, anchored above, couldn't pull him up. Couldn't communicate. Couldn't see him. He just felt the weight on the rope, dragging him slowly toward the edge. If Simpson didn't get off the rope, they'd both fall. So Yates made a decision that has been debated ever since. He cut the rope. Simpson fell into a crevasse and disappeared. Yates, devastated, assumed his partner was dead. He descended alone, reached base camp, and prepared to leave. Meanwhile, Simpson woke up at the bottom of the crevasse, 100 feet down, leg shattered, alone in the dark. He should have died there. But he didn't. He crawled. For 3 days, he dragged himself across the glacier, through ice fields, down moraines, using his ice axes as crutches, hallucinating, hypothermic, barely conscious. He crawled 5 miles. On the 3rd night, he heard voices. Yates hadn't left yet. Simpson screamed. Yates heard him, ran out into the snow, found his partner, alive, impossibly alive. Simpson survived. Yates was later criticized by some in the climbing community for cutting the rope. Others said he'd made the only rational choice. The two men remained friends. Simpson wrote a book about it, Touching the Void, and said he'd have done the same thing. Now we turn to the ocean again, but this time, survival meant endurance of a different kind. In 1968, Robin Knox Johnston entered the Sunday Times Golden Globe race, the first non-stop solo sailing race around the world. 9 sailors started. Only one finished. Knox Johnston wasn't the fastest or the most experienced. He was just the most stubborn. His boat, the Suhaili, was a 32-foot wooden ketch, slow, leaky, and uncomfortable. For 312 days, he sailed alone, 30,000 miles, never stopping at port, never seeing another human. He fought storms in the Southern Ocean, waves 60 feet high that nearly capsized him. His radio broke. His self-steering system failed. He repaired everything with duct tape, wire, and hope. He ran out of food and caught fish. Ran out of water and collected rain. At one point, his boat was damaged so badly that he considered abandoning the race. But there was no rescue, no backup plan. So he fixed it and kept going. The loneliness was worse than the storms. Months without conversation, without touch, without another voice. He talked to himself, sang to the fish, wrote long letters he'd never send. When he finally crossed the finish line in April 1969, he'd won. Not because he was the best sailor, but because he'd simply refused to stop. The psychological toll of solo long-distance sailing is brutal. Another competitor in the same race, Donald Crowhurst, unable to handle the isolation and the pressure, falsified his logs and eventually committed suicide at sea. Knox Johnston kept sailing until the job was done. Let's move to 1972 and the Andes again, but this time with a different group. The survivors of the Uruguayan rugby team crash weren't the only ones to face impossible survival scenarios in those mountains. In October of that same year, a husband and wife, Douglas and Anna Mawson, though no relation to the famous Antarctic explorer of the same name, were hiking in the remote Patagonian Andes when a sudden avalanche buried their camp. They dug themselves out, but their supplies, tent, and most of their gear were gone. They had minimal food, no shelter, and were 2 days' hike from the nearest road. They started walking. The weather turned. Snow fell. Temperatures dropped. Anna developed hypothermia. Douglas carried her on his back for hours until he collapsed. They found a shallow cave, huddled together for warmth, and waited. For 3 days, they survived on snow and a single chocolate bar. On the 3rd day, a search helicopter spotted them. Both survived, but Anna lost 3 toes to frostbite. Now to the Pacific, 1982, where Stephen Callahan became another name on the list of those who refused to let the ocean claim them. Callahan was a boat designer and sailor, crossing the Atlantic alone in a small sloop he'd built himself. A week into the voyage, something, maybe a whale, maybe debris, struck the hull at night. The boat sank in minutes. Callahan grabbed his survival raft and emergency supplies and watched his boat, his home, disappear beneath the waves. He was 800 miles from land. The raft was 6 feet in diameter. For 76 days, Callahan drifted across the Atlantic, using a makeshift spear to catch fish, a solar still to desalinate water. He tracked his position with a sextant, plotting a course he had no power to follow. Storms flipped his raft. Sharks circled constantly. He developed sores that wouldn't heal, infections that spread. But he kept a journal, maintained routines, and rationed his hope like he rationed his water. On the 76th day, fishermen from the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe found him. He drifted 1,800 miles. We travel now to the jungles of Colombia, where in 2023, 4 children survived 40 days alone after their plane crashed in the Amazon. The youngest was just 11 months old. The oldest, 13. Their mother died in the crash. The children, members of an indigenous group with deep knowledge of the rainforest, walked for weeks, eating seeds, roots, and cassava flour they found in the wreckage. They built shelters, avoided predators, and stayed together. When rescuers finally found them, the children were thin, covered in insect bites, but alive. The 13-year-old had kept her siblings alive through knowledge passed down from her elders and sheer determination. It was called the miracle of the jungle. But miracles don't build shelters or ration food. Children with courage and knowledge do. Back to the mountains. In 1996, the Everest disaster killed 8 climbers in a single day, but several others survived against impossible odds. Beck Weathers, an American pathologist, was left for dead twice. Caught in a blizzard at 28,000 feet, blinded by the cold, he collapsed. His teammates, barely surviving themselves, assumed he was gone. They radioed base camp that Weathers had died. But Weathers wasn't dead. He was frozen, unconscious, and clinically hypothermic. But not dead. Hours later, he woke up, alone, in the dark, on the side of Everest. He stood up and walked. Somehow, he navigated back to camp, a distance that should have been impossible in his condition. When he stumbled into the tents, the other climbers thought they were seeing a ghost. Weathers survived, though he lost both hands, his nose, and parts of his face to frostbite. But he walked off that mountain. We turn now to the deserts of Australia, where in 1977, Ricky McGee's car broke down in the remote outback. He set off walking for help. Days turned into weeks. He survived by eating leeches, grasshoppers, and frogs from a muddy waterhole. He lost 120 pounds, dropping from 230 to 110. When farmers finally found him after 71 days, he was skeletal, delirious, barely recognizable as human, but alive. In 2003, Aaron Ralston became one of the most famous survival stories when a boulder trapped his arm in a Utah canyon. After 5 days, with no hope of rescue, no water, and hallucinating from dehydration, he made a choice. He broke his own arm bones and amputated his forearm with a dull multi-tool knife. It took him over an hour. Then he rappelled down a cliff, hiked 7 miles, and was found by other hikers. He survived, wrote a book, and continued climbing. Because once you've cut off your own arm to escape death, regular life doesn't seem so hard. 1961, a French woman named Madame Jane Horny was traveling with her husband across the Algerian Sahara when their car broke down in the middle of nowhere. They waited for help, but none came. After days, her husband, desperate for water, walked off in search of a well. He never returned. Madame Horny waited. 1 day became 3, 3 became a week. She had no water, no food, just the brutal sun and the knowledge that her husband was likely dead. She survived by drinking radiator fluid mixed with sand to create some kind of moisture, eating leather from the car seats, and sheltering in the vehicle during the day. After 12 days, a military patrol found her unconscious, nearly dead. Her husband's body was discovered miles away. He'd walked in circles until he collapsed. She'd survived by staying still, counterintuitive but correct. Let's go back to the sea one more time, this time to 1942, where another man's ocean survival story nearly matched Poon Lim's. Ensign William Willis was a merchant marine whose ship was torpedoed in the Caribbean. He clung to a raft for 11 days before being rescued. But that wasn't his remarkable survival story. That came later. In 1954, at age 60, Willis decided to prove that ancient Polynesians could have crossed the Pacific on simple rafts. He built a balsa raft and sailed from Peru to American Samoa. The journey took 115 days. He survived storms, equipment failures, and near starvation. When he arrived, people called him crazy. So 7 years later, at age 67, he did it again. This time on a steel raft, sailing from Peru to Australia. The voyage took 205 days. He was 70 years old when he completed it. He survived not because he was particularly skilled, but because he was too stubborn to die. Now we move to 2008 and the Mumbai terrorist attacks, where survival meant hiding in hotel rooms while gunmen hunted floor by floor. Hundreds of people survived that night through quick thinking and silence. One couple hid in a bathroom for hours, standing in the shower while terrorists fired through the door. They survived by not moving, not breathing loudly, not making a sound. Others locked themselves in rooms and built barricades from furniture, waiting in the dark while they heard gunfire echoing through the halls. When you can't run and you can't fight, survival becomes about disappearing. To the frozen tundra of Alaska in 2007, where a man named Tyson Steele survived for 3 weeks in -50-degree weather after his cabin burned down. He lost everything in the fire. His shelter, his supplies, his way to call for help. He had the clothes on his back and a desperate need to stay alive. He built a snow cave using a shovel he'd salvaged from the ashes, insulated it with spruce boughs, and maintained a small fire that he couldn't let die because he had no way to restart it. He melted snow for water, ate what little dried food he'd managed to save, and rationed his calories like a miser. The cold was so intense that exposed skin froze in seconds. He wrapped himself in every piece of fabric he could find, slept in short intervals because sleeping too long meant freezing, and kept moving to generate body heat. After 23 days, a state trooper on a routine flyover saw his SOS signals stamped in the snow. Steele had survived nearly a month in temperatures that kill most people in hours. Back to the jungle, but this time the Congo, 1975. A British mercenary named John Peters, though his story was only partially documented and remains controversial, claimed he survived 43 days alone in the rainforest after his unit was ambushed and scattered. Peters walked north, using the sun for navigation, eating termites, grubs, and whatever plants he recognized from survival training. He contracted malaria, dysentery, and developed infected wounds that he treated with moss and tree sap. When he finally stumbled into a village, the locals thought he was a ghost. A white man, skeletal and delirious, emerging from the jungle like something from a nightmare. The details of his story have been questioned over the years, but what's undeniable is that he survived something that should have killed him. To the mountains of Nepal in 2006, where Lincoln Hall, an Australian climber, was left for dead on Everest at 28,000 feet. His climbing team, after trying to save him for hours, finally radioed that Hall had died. They descended, grieving, and prepared to inform his family. But the next morning, another climbing team ascending the mountain found Hall. Sitting upright in the snow, jacket off, gloves off, rambling incoherently about being on a boat. He'd survived the night at the death zone without shelter, without oxygen, in temperatures that kill. The climbers gave him oxygen, wrapped him in their spare clothes, and called for help. A rescue team managed to bring him down. Hall survived severe frostbite and brain damage from oxygen deprivation, but he lived. His own team had called him dead, and he'd walked back from it. Now we shift to 1988 and the Piper Alpha oil rig disaster in the North Sea. The rig exploded, turning into an inferno that killed 167 men. But some survived through impossible escapes. One man, Andy Moken, was 100 feet above the water when the fire reached his section of the rig. The heat was so intense that steel was melting. He had two choices, burn to death or jump 100 feet into freezing water. He jumped, survived the fall, survived the flames on the surface of the water, survived the hypothermia. He was picked up by a rescue boat hours later, one of the lucky 61 who lived. His survival was a combination of split-second decisions and the human body's astonishing ability to withstand impact that should pulverize it. To the American frontier, 1823, where Hugh Glass became one of history's most legendary survivors. A mountain man and fur trapper, Glass was mauled by a grizzly bear in what is now South Dakota. The bear tore his throat, broke his ribs, left him barely alive. His companions, certain he would die, dug a shallow grave, took his weapons and supplies, and left him. Glass woke up, alone, mutilated, and 200 miles from the nearest settlement. He set his own broken leg, let maggots eat the dead flesh from his wounds to prevent infection, and began to crawl. For 6 weeks, he crawled across the prairie, surviving on berries, roots, and the carcass of a buffalo that wolves had killed. He reached the settlement of Fort Kiowa, emaciated, scarred, but alive. Then he walked another 300 miles to track down the men who'd abandoned him. When he found them, he didn't kill them. He forgave them. Because surviving had taken everything he had, and revenge simply wasn't worth the energy. Now we turn to space, or nearly space, where in 1971, the crew of Apollo 13 survived one of the most famous near disasters in history. An oxygen tank exploded 200,000 miles from Earth, crippling the spacecraft. The mission to land on the moon was aborted instantly. Now the only goal was to come home. Commander Jim Lovell, along with Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert, had to nurse a dying spacecraft around the moon and back to Earth with limited power, limited water, and carbon dioxide building up to lethal levels. They built air scrubbers from duct tape and cardboard, rationed water until they were severely dehydrated, and navigated using methods not used since the early days of seafaring. Ground control worked around the clock to calculate trajectories and power budgets. When the command modules splashed down in the Pacific 4 days later, it was called a successful failure. They didn't land on the moon, but they came home. 3 men survived the void because engineers on the ground and astronauts in space refused to accept that the mission was over. Back to the ocean, 1952, where Ann Davison became the first woman to sail solo across the Atlantic. Her journey took 65 days, but it wasn't her first survival story. Years earlier, she and her husband had attempted to sail to the Caribbean when their boat was wrecked in a storm off the English coast. Her husband drowned, and survived by clinging to wreckage for hours until she was washed ashore. Years later, grief turned into determination, and she crossed the Atlantic alone, proving that survival isn't just about living through tragedy but about continuing afterward. To 1912 and the sinking of the Titanic, where 706 people survived out of 2,224. Most survival stories from that night are about luck, being near a lifeboat, being a woman or child given priority. But one story stands out. Charles Juffin, the ship's chief baker, survived by drinking whiskey, which he believed kept him warm, a medical myth but psychologically useful, and by treading water for over 2 hours in near-freezing temperatures. When he was finally pulled aboard a lifeboat, he had no symptoms of hypothermia. Doctors couldn't explain it. Juffin credited the alcohol. Science says he was just impossibly lucky. Either way, he survived when hundreds around him froze to death in minutes. Fast forward to 1991, and the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Thousands fled, but some were trapped by the ash and lahars, volcanic mudflows. One family survived by climbing onto their roof as the mudflow consumed their house. For 3 days, they clung to the roof as it floated on a river of volcanic debris, dodging boulders and debris, before finally washing up on solid ground miles away. Survival in a natural disaster often comes down to staying above the destruction, whether it's water, mud, or lava. Now to 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami. Over 200,000 people died. But there were miraculous survivals. One woman, Risal Shaputri, clung to a palm tree for hours as waves battered her. Another man, Arya Frizel, floated on a piece of debris for 3 days before being rescued at sea. A young boy in Sri Lanka survived by climbing into a tree as the water rose, then staying there for 2 days, surrounded by bodies, wreckage, and rising water, until rescuers in a boat found him. Tsunami survival is about vertical escape. Get high and hold on. Back to the mountains, 1953, when Maurice Herzog and Louis Lequinel became the first men to summit an 8,000-meter peak, Annapurna. But the descent nearly killed them. Herzog lost his gloves at the summit and developed severe frostbite. By the time they reached base camp, both men's hands and feet were gangrenous. Doctors amputated Herzog's fingers and toes without anesthesia because they had none. Both men survived, though neither climbed again. Herzog later wrote that surviving Annapurna was harder than summiting it. To the Arctic again, 1913, where the Karluk, a ship in the Canadian Arctic expedition, was trapped in ice and eventually crushed. The crew abandoned ship and set up camp on an ice floe. Captain Robert Bartlett led a small team across the ice to Siberia, over 700 miles, to find help. He walked for months, navigating by stars, surviving on seal meat, and fighting frostbite. He reached a Russian settlement, arranged for rescue ships, and saved most of his crew. 11 men died, but 25 survived because of Bartlett's refusal to abandon them. Now to 1985, a different kind of survival story. In Mexico City, a massive earthquake killed thousands. Hospitals collapsed. Buildings pancaked. In one hospital, babies in the maternity ward were buried under rubble. Rescue workers found them days later, still alive, some still crying. They called them the miracle babies. 7 newborns, trapped in the rubble for up to 7 days, survived without food or water. Doctors couldn't explain how. Newborns are fragile, should die within hours without care. But these didn't. They were found, adopted by families across Mexico, and grew up healthy. Sometimes survival is beyond explanation. To the Amazon again, 1981, where Yossi Ginsberg, an Israeli backpacker, survived 3 weeks alone in the Bolivian jungle after his raft broke apart. His companion drowned. Ginsberg, injured and lost, wandered through the rainforest eating nothing but berries and the occasional egg stolen from nests. He contracted trench foot, his feet rotting from constant moisture. He hallucinated, hearing voices, seeing people. At one point, he considered letting the jungle take him. But every morning, he woke up and kept walking. On the 19th day, he stumbled onto a riverbank where a Bolivian search party found him. He'd lost 30 pounds. His feet required months to heal. But he walked out. To the sea once more, 1972, where Dougal Robertson and his family survived 38 days on a raft after their yacht was sunk by killer whales. Yes, whales attacked their boat, punched holes in it, and watched it sink. The Robertson family, including children, crowded onto an inflatable raft and a small dinghy. They caught rainwater, speared fish and turtles, and drank turtle blood when water ran low. The children, remarkably, never panicked. They played games, sang songs, and trusted their father. When a Japanese fishing vessel finally spotted them, the whole family was alive, thin but unbroken. Now to the city, 2001, September 11th. The Twin Towers collapsed, killing nearly 3,000 people. But there were survivals that defied logic. A group of firefighters in Stairwell B of the North Tower survived the collapse because the stairwell created a pocket that didn't completely collapse. They were buried under tons of rubble but alive. They shouted for hours before rescuers heard them. One by one, they were pulled out, the last survivors found in the ruins. They lived because a random stairwell held when everything around it disintegrated. To 1944 and the Pacific Theater of World War II, where Poon Lim's story was not unique. Many sailors survived weeks at sea. But one stands out, Louis Zamperini, an Olympic runner turned bomber crewman. His plane crashed into the ocean. He and 2 others survived on a raft for 47 days, drifting over 2,000 miles. They caught birds with their bare hands, ate raw fish, and fought off sharks by punching them. One man died on the raft. Zamperini and the other survivor reached land only to be captured by the Japanese and sent to a POW camp, where Zamperini endured 2 more years of torture and starvation. He survived that too. After the war, he returned to America, struggled with PTSD and alcoholism, then found peace through forgiveness. His survival story became the book and film Unbroken. Back to the mountains one more time, 2005, where a Russian climber named Anatoly Bukreev. Wait, wrong story, Bukreev died in 1997. Let's correct this. In 2006, a British climber named David Sharp was left to die on Everest after collapsing near the summit. Over 40 climbers passed him, most too focused on their own survival to stop. He died alone, a controversial moment in mountaineering ethics. But the same day, Lincoln Hall, mentioned earlier, survived being left for dead. The difference, some climbers chose to help Hall, sacrificing their summit attempt to save him. Sharp had no one willing to risk themselves. Survival on Everest sometimes depends on who walks past you. Now we shift to survival of a different kind. In 1995, a man named Joe Kittinger, a retired Air Force pilot, had already survived one of the most insane feats decades earlier. In 1960, he jumped from a balloon at 102,800 feet, nearly 20 miles high, in a pressure suit. He free fell for over 4 minutes, reaching speeds of 614 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. His right glove malfunctioned during ascent, causing his hand to swell to twice its size. But he jumped anyway, survived the fall, deployed his parachute, and landed safely in the New Mexico desert. It was a survival story that began with a decision to jump from the edge of space. Let's turn now to the wilderness of Siberia, where in 1978, Russian geologists discovered a family, the Lykovs, living in complete isolation. They'd fled religious persecution in the 1930s and had been living in the taiga for over 40 years. The parents and 4 children survived by hunting, gathering, and growing a small garden. They had no contact with the outside world, didn't know World War II had happened, and spoke an archaic dialect of Russian. When the geologists found them, the children had never seen another human outside their family. The mother had died years earlier, and the family had continued surviving through brutal winters and near starvation. When offered help, they mostly refused, preferring isolation. 3 of the children eventually died, but the youngest daughter, Agafia, still lives there today, alone, surviving in the same cabin, the same forest, the same way her family did for decades. To the ocean again, but a different kind of story. In 1942, a British sailor named Teddy Sheen was aboard the HMAS Armidale when it was attacked by Japanese bombers. The ship was sinking. Sheen was wounded but strapped himself to an anti-aircraft gun and kept firing at the planes as the ship went down, giving his crewmates time to abandon ship. He went down with the gun still firing. He didn't survive, but his actions saved others. Sometimes survival stories are about the ones who don't make it but make sure others do. Back to the mountains, but this time to the Rockies, 2003, where a snowboarder named Eric Lamarck got lost in a blizzard at Mammoth Mountain, California. He survived 8 days in the wilderness, temperatures dropping below zero, with no food and minimal gear. He ate bark and pine needles, melted snow for water, and built snow caves. His feet froze solid. When rescuers finally found him, both legs were amputated below the knee. But he survived and later became a motivational speaker, saying that losing his legs saved his life because it forced him to change. To the desert of Arizona, 2001, where Ricky Gilmore, a hiker, survived 5 days in the wilderness after getting lost. He had no water, no food, and temperatures reached 110 degrees. He survived by finding a small puddle of water in a rock depression, drinking it slowly to avoid getting sick. He rationed it for 3 days, then walked toward the direction he thought was civilization. On the 5th day, nearly dead, he stumbled onto a road and was picked up by a passing truck. He'd lost 25 pounds and was severely dehydrated, but alive. Now to 1912 again, but not the Titanic. The same year, British explorer Robert Falcon Scott reached the South Pole only to find that Norwegian Roald Amundsen had beaten him by a month. Defeated and exhausted, Scott and his team began the 800-mile trek back to their base. They never made it. One by one, the men died. Scott, along with 2 others, was trapped in a blizzard just 11 miles from a supply depot that could have saved them. They froze to death in their tent, but Scott kept writing in his journal until he couldn't hold the pen anymore. His last entry read, "For God's sake, look after our people." They didn't survive, but their story became one of endurance and tragedy that defined the heroic age of exploration. To 2018 and the Thai Cave Rescue. 12 boys and their soccer coach became trapped in Tam Luang Cave when sudden rains flooded the entrance. They were stuck for 18 days, 2.5 miles inside the mountain, in complete darkness. They survived by drinking water dripping from the cave walls and staying calm. When British divers finally found them, the boys were weak but alive. The rescue operation required sedating each boy and diving them out through flooded passages, a procedure so risky that one Thai Navy SEAL diver died during the effort. But all 12 boys and their coach survived. They didn't panic. They conserved energy. And they trusted that someone would come. Back to the sea one final time, 2013, where a cook named Harrison O'Keen survived 3 days underwater in an air pocket after his tugboat sank off the coast of Nigeria. The boat flipped and sank 100 feet to the ocean floor. O'Keen, in the crew's quarters, was trapped. But a small air pocket formed in one bathroom. He survived in that pocket, in complete darkness, listening to fish eating the bodies of his crewmates floating nearby. After 60 hours, a salvage dive team came to recover bodies. One diver saw a hand reaching out in his flashlight beam and nearly had a heart attack. They surfaced O'Keen slowly to avoid decompression sickness. He survived, traumatized but alive. These are the stories history remembers. Not because these people were heroes. Most would say they were just trying not to die. But that's the point. Survival isn't about heroism. It's about continuing. About making the next decision, taking the next step, lasting one more day. It's about refusing to let circumstance have the final word. Whether it's ice, water, jungle, mountain, or desert, the lesson is the same. The human body can endure almost anything if the human will decides it must. And when you study these stories long enough, a pattern emerges. The ones who survive aren't always the strongest or the smartest or the best prepared. They're the ones who don't stop, who ration hope like it's the last supply they have, who treat each moment as negotiable rather than final. Survival isn't a miracle. It's stubbornness dressed in human skin, walking, crawling, swimming, or drifting until the world finally lets go.